So we'll move to English now. So I have a great pleasure and tremendous honor to introduce Christiana Figueres to all of you today. Christiana is our keynote speaker, but she was also the winner of the 2019 Dan David Prize for the topic of combating climate change, which she received a month ago here at Tel Aviv University. Christiana was appointed Executive Secretary of the United Nations Climate Convention in June 2010, 6 months after the failed negotiations in Copenhagen at COP15. At the time, the global mood on climate change could not have been more pessimistic. For 6 years, Christiana worked tirelessly to bring 195 countries together to sign the Paris 2015 agreement for reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere while also addressing financial flows, technology, and capacity building in the developing world. It is the world's most far-reaching global climate agreement, and many claim it is the greatest diplomatic agreement in history. And without Christiana, the agreement would not have occurred. So how did she do it? With her optimism, her attitude of failure is not an option, she has proved that the power of optimism, collaboration, and a stubborn refusal to accept that problems of our time are beyond our capacity to solve. She showed leaders of the world that the risk of action is less than the risk of inaction, and that by acting now, there is a huge opportunities for all of us, whether it's cleaner air, innovative technologies, and huge economic growth. But we have to act now. As 16-year-old Greta Thunberg from Sweden says, act as if your house is on fire, because it is. Whether you measure Christiana's impact on tons of greenhouse gases removed from the atmosphere, a transformed global diplomacy, or the encouragement of new innovative technologies, when talking about the health of the planet, no one has made a bigger contribution to our collective future than Christiana. For those in the audience, you may also want to know that Christiana has a personal connection to all of us here in Israel. Her father was the president of Costa Rica 3 times, and during the first period in 1948, Costa Rica was one of the first countries to recognize the State of Israel. And in the 1980s, Christiana's mother was the Costa Rican ambassador to Israel. So before I invite Christiana to address us, we'd like to show you a short movie which was produced by the Dan David Foundation and was shown a month ago here at the university. So.
Impossible is not a fact, it's an attitude. It's only an attitude. And I decided that I was going to change my attitude and I was going to help the world change its attitude on climate change. On December 12, 2015, in Paris, under the United Nations, 195 governments got together and unanimously decided to intentionally change the course of the global economy in order to protect the most vulnerable and improve the life of all of us. Now that is a remarkable achievement.
I fundamentally believe not only that people are more motivated by positive than by negative, but also because there is such opportunity in addressing climate change. And I think, several years ago we made the huge mistake of putting out a doom and gloom message, unless you do this, some kind of apocalypse. Well, how is that going to get us any further? The fact is that there's such huge opportunities for job creation, for new technology, energy security, for food security, for water security. It's actually fundamentally much more of a good news agenda than it is a bad news agenda.
It's a sacred opportunity that all of us are having right now to be alive and to be adults in the moment in which history and mankind are actually just in such incredible transformation.
So I'd like to invite Christiana to the stage to address us. The topic is the climate challenge. Where are we? Where are we?
This one works, right? Shalom, good morning. How are you all? It's always difficult when you follow a tall person. Get back down to my level. Thank you. Do you prefer me to use that? No, this is okay, right? Oh, okay. Thank you. So delightful to be here. Thank you very much, Colin. Thank you for the invitation to be back in Israel just a few seconds after I left last time. Unfortunately, despite the fact that my family has so many ties to Israel, I do not speak Hebrew, as I was asked. Do you speak Hebrew? But I take it that the presentation before me was about the positive impacts of forestry. Is that correct? More or less. The what? Oh, the mixed effect. Well, I saw albedo, that would be good. I saw temperature. What would the negative effects be? Oh, okay. Well, yes, okay. Thank you for that. I was actually quite tickled that I walked in the middle of that because just yesterday I received a preview of a study on forestry that I have been longing for years. And it's finally going to come out in a couple of weeks. And it is an estimation of how much land do we have on this planet that could actually be planted with trees without impinging either on food production or on areas that are or should be destined to human living. And that is a number that is really important for us to understand, right? Because forest cover does have an incredible carbon sequestration capacity, and it would be, I think, if we're able to extend the forest cover, we would be able to hopefully avoid, at least for a few years, the use of geological carbon capture and storage. So I think of forest cover and growth of biomass as biological carbon capture and storage. And I know that scientists in the room will cringe when I say that, but that's the way I think about it, biological carbon capture and storage, which I certainly prefer over geological carbon capture and storage that I think is still too risky and certainly way too expensive. And the number there is actually quite impressive. So it's 0.9 billion hectares on this planet, according to this study that will come out in a few weeks, which is the land that is available for forestry cover, for increased forestry cover, in addition, of course, to restoration of degraded soils. But for increased forest cover, 0.9 billion hectares is actually a pretty impressive area, and one that we should be thinking about. How nice it would be to have this little blue marble of ours be again a blue and green marble, which is what we should have the marble being, the planet. Anyway, those were sort of entry thoughts as I walked in to that presentation. Today, I thought one thing that I wanted to invite you to do is to take our thinking from, this really doesn't like me. Anything better? If I stand here, is that better? Yeah, am I too close? Okay. Once you get into seeing the details that we were just seeing now, it's also good, I think, to do that and to have the mental capacity to stand far away from the details at the same time. I always enjoy picking two realities that are very, very different and holding them in equal standing, because both are true. So my compliment to the details and very geographically located details that we were looking at, my compliment to that is to remind ourselves that all of us alive today are living in a very new, very, very young geological era. Who here is born more or less in the 1950s or before? Okay, so those of us born, and I count myself in, those of us born in the 1950s, we all deserve a huge congratulations. Little applause to everybody born in the 1950s or before, because we belong to a very, very select group of humans, very few of us, who have actually lived in two geological eras. So those of us born in the 1950s and before were born and lived our first years in the Holocene age, and after the 1950s, we entered into the Anthropocene age. That is quite a daunting thought, that over the past 50 years, we humans have been able, in quotation marks, we have been able to so transform the natural environment that we have not naturally, according to nature, but humanly, actually completely catapulted the world from one geological era into another. And that is especially daunting when you remember that the Holocene age was 10,000 years, and that the planet is 4.5 billion years old. I was recently invited to the birthday party of the planet, 4.5. How many times have you been to a birthday party of 4.5 billion years? The size of the cake was enormous, as you can imagine. But the planet has been here for 4.5 billion years. It will probably be here, you know, for billions of years, even after us, if we decide to be so stupid to leave. But the point is that in those 4.5 billion years, it is only a few thousand years, let's call it 10,000 years, in which we have had a stability of natural conditions, temperature, precipitation, that were conducive to the expansion of humanity. So at the beginning of the Holocene, we had more or less 100,000 people around the world, and they were definitely hunter-gatherers trying to eke out, trying to extract a living from very, very difficult natural conditions. And during those 10,000 years, we had a stabilization of temperatures, of CO2 concentrations, of precipitation that allowed for humans to propagate to the point where we're now 7 billion people. That definitely is evidence enough of a good environment for propagation. So from the point of view of the history of the planet, those 10,000 years, you can think of them as a sweet spot during which it was actually quite, as I say, conducive to human well-being. Now, the daunting thought is that we have been able, not nature, she did not do it, but we have in the past 50 years, we have caused so much disruption in the negative sense, because I know technologists talk about disruption in the positive sense. In this case, there is such disruption negatively of our natural ecosystems and our biosphere that we have actually caused the end of one geological era and the beginning of the next, the Anthropocene, called Anthropocene because of man's agency over nature. how is it possible that in 50 years we managed to practically destroy that very conducive environment that we had? And if we just measure it in terms of biodiversity, in those 50 years, we have managed to make extinct 60% of the species that were alive in the 1960s and 70s. We have managed to increase CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere to now 415 ppm, parts per million, which has never been seen before, certainly not in the history of humankind, and in fact not even in geological history that has been measured. We have been incredibly irresponsible in 50 years. What is important to remember about that is that we didn't do it purposely. None of us actually knew when we were out there, you know, pursuing growth and economic development. No one, let's call it the generation previous to mine, and the one before that, and the one before that, they didn't know that the pursuit of economic growth and development on the basis of fossil fuels was actually having this very, very negative effect. So this is not to blame them, my generation or generations before. It's also not to blame fossil fuels. It's also not to blame the industries that brought those fossil fuels to us. This is to recognize that the human well-being that we have had was definitely acquired on the back of the burning of fossil fuel. But, so thank you for that, right? Thank you to the fossil fuels for a lot of the creature comforts that we today enjoy. But those fossil fuels actually belong in the museum by now. Just like, you know, little old ladies like me, I hope that I'm going to be thanked and put in the retirement home very soon. Well, that's what we should do, certainly with coal to start with. Thank coal for what it has done in the past and move it into the museum. And, you know, I would very much like to be there when we open the museum to the internal combustion engine, as we will soon. So this is not a blaming exercise, but it is an exercise in recognizing responsibility. And it is responsibility not so much for the past, but really for the future. Because now we do know. Contrary to my parents' and my grandparents' generation, now we do know. And so now we cannot hide behind ignorance of the facts. We have plenty of information in front of us. So today, with that context, larger context of where we are in the moment of history, I actually want to address my words this morning to the young people. I already asked who was born in the 1950s. Now I would like to address all of you who are in your 20s and 30s. Who are you in the 20s and 30s? Okay. So, this is about you, okay? If you're still studying, or if you are starting your professional life, I think you will recognize that there are just an incredible number of topics that are out there that are challenging and that would require the application of your brain for solutions. However, I guarantee that none of the challenges out there that you are facing today, but in particular, none of the challenges that you will face in the rest of your adult life, none of them are as far-reaching or as omnipresent as climate change. I guarantee that to be the case. I also recognize that there is a very important relationship with respect to climate change between my generation and your generation. because my generation is the first generation to have all of the science, all of the science. We have now quite detailed understanding of what has caused climate change and also what would lead to the various thresholds, the tipping points that would take us beyond anything that we could manage. So my generation has developed the scientific understanding that we needed in order to take action, and I thank those scientists in my generation for that. My generation has also started the policy frameworks that are needed to address climate change. We have also started to shift financial flows, and we have definitely started to develop the technologies that are necessary to address climate change. Started. That is, I would say, my generation's contribution to righting, not W-R-I, but R-I-G-H-T, to making right what is so wrong. But I also recognize that my generation will not finish the job. The job will have to be finished by you. So the job of my generation is to take, so to speak, a huge tanker that has been moving toward disaster and toward crashing and shifting the course of that tanker. Your generation's job is going to have to be to finish that journey of that tanker in a different direction. While you're doing that, while you are taking humanity in a very different direction, which is your generation's responsibility, I'm afraid to tell you that you, those of you who are 20s and your 30s today, you are the first generation that will feel the full impacts of climate change. Because those of us right now can see, certainly on the news, the effects of droughts, wildfires, cyclones, floods. We see that all the time, but that is the beginning of the effect of climate change. Your generation will be the first one that sees the full impact of climate change. And so no matter what profession you choose or have chosen, whether you are into business, finance, health, agriculture, the built environment as architects, social science, certainly natural science, high tech, even the arts, whatever area you are in, it is indisputable that you're going to live in a world that has been fundamentally, and I would say irreversibly, changed. That is the first time in human history that that has happened. It is absolutely true that society will become much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. That is already the case. The question is whether, in addition to becoming much more vulnerable, whether we can also become at the same time more resilient. That is the question that is in front of us. We cannot change anymore the loading of the atmosphere that we have. That's going to be with us for quite a while. The question is, can we actually increase the resilience with which both humanity, as well as the natural systems with which we experience and go through this century of climate change. To be very honest with you, yes, I have devoted many years of my life to climate change and the last 6 before the Paris Agreement to developing and delivering the Paris Agreement. And let me be the first one to tell you that the Paris Agreement, yes, it was a historical achievement. Yes, it was very necessary. And 2 things. Number 1, necessary but not enough. because it actually has to be implemented. Having a very good plan is a good idea, but if you don't implement it, the plan doesn't help you at all. And secondly, we have to realize that the Paris Agreement will accompany us for several decades, and I will talk a little bit about how that's going to do that. But it's not going to solve climate change. What Paris Agreement, in its best case, fully implemented, will do is to minimize the impacts of climate change. But it's not going to solve climate change because we're too late for that. Had we actually realized what we were doing and brought down our emissions 20 to 30 years ago, then we could perhaps have minimized, extremely minimized, or solved climate change. But we actually have too much loading in the atmosphere, so we're never going to solve climate change. That's why I say that you will live in an irreversibly changed and transformed world, because climate change will be with you for the rest of your lives. So the Paris Agreement will not solve climate change. What Paris Agreement attempts to do is actually to minimize the impacts, at least until someone, and hopefully a startup here in Tel Aviv, is going to invent and develop a huge technology that zaps CO2 out of the atmosphere and does so safely and cheaply. That one we don't have yet. But what we do have is, I would say, a progressively improving plan on climate change. And why do I mean progressively? Because before 2015, it was very clear that the world was heading toward at least 4 to 6 degrees increase in global average temperature. 4 to 6 degrees, which would have put us clearly over certain tipping points, such as summer ice sheet in the Arctic, perhaps even Amazon forest turning into savannas, the boreal forests of Canada and Russia actually disappearing, certainly coral reefs gone, several ecosystems that have the capacity to flip over very, very quickly and cause an even more accelerated warming of the planet. And that's where we were before 2015. We were definitely heading for 4 to 6 degrees increase in temperature. With the adoption of the Paris Agreement, 2 things happened. First, the sum total of the pledges that were made by all of the countries, 189 countries, 195 adopted the Paris Agreement, but 189 actually made numerical pledges. But the sum total of those pledges, when they're implemented, and they're all actually pretty well on implementation, and we can discuss that later, would take us no longer to 4 to 6 degrees, but somewhere between 3.5 to 3.7 degrees. So shaving off no longer 6 degree scenario, no longer 5 degree scenario, coming under 4 degree scenario. So that's actually an improvement. Furthermore, the Paris Agreement says, yes, we recognize that these countries can do this effort now, but we also recognize that with shifting capital, with better policy, and certainly with better technologies, we can do more in the future. And so the climate agreement sets out a pathway of 5-year cycles during which every 5 years countries come together to increase their emission reduction commitments. And the sum total of those over several decades would take us then to the ultimate destination of the Paris Agreement, which is somewhere below, well below 2 degrees to 1.5. So somewhere between 1.5 and well below 2 degrees. That is where we have to be, or rather, let me say, to be much more specific, as of October of last year, with the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, climate scientists of the world, we have now understood that that flexibility that we thought we had in 2015 to be somewhere between 1.5 and well below 2 degrees, that flexibility is out of the system. Because that half a degree between 1.5 and 2 degrees has now been shown to make a world of difference. Who would have known that half a degree average global temperature would actually lead us to two completely different worlds? And it does. Because the projections are that a world, the contrast between a world that goes to 1.5 degrees by 2100 and a world that goes to 2 degrees by 2100 would mean 2 to 3 times as much species lost if we go to 2 degrees, 2 to 3 times as many people exposed to life-threatening heat and food insecurity, i.e. death, 2 to 3 times as much physical infrastructure loss, and of course 2 to 3 times as much negative economic impact. So that half a degree has now been shown by scientists to actually be the critical space within which we are working. Because after the Paris Agreement, most jurisdictions, most companies, most cities, most countries actually set their target for 2 degrees, because that's mentioned in the Paris Agreement. And now we know we have to search and replace. Search for 2 degrees everywhere and replace with 1.5, because it is the only moral destination that is capable for us to give to the new generations. That's a pretty daunting task. And just to show you how daunting it is, could I have a piece of paper, because I don't have sound today? Could anybody give me a piece of paper? Thank you. Thank you. So just to show you how daunting that task is, have this be represent 40 gigatons of CO2, which is the global total emissions, annual emissions that we have. Actually, we're already at 41, but just for simplicity. Have this be 40 gigatons. That's what we are emitting every year as a planet. And in order to get us to maximum 1.5, or to carbon neutrality by 2050, which is the same thing, just expressed in different ways, here's what we would have to do. We would have to take these 40 gigatons, which is what we have right now, and by next year, which is only 6 months from now, by next year, we would have to put ourselves in the position of being able to reduce those 40 gigatons to 1/2 of the 40. So 1/2 of 40 in Israel is? I hope it's the same in Costa Rica. 20. Okay, so reduce from 40 to 20 gigatons by 2030. Okay, so over the first decade, we would have to reduce to 20 gigatons. Over the next decade, from 2030 to 2040, we would have to reduce again 1/2. And then over the final decade, 2040 to 2050, we would have to reduce again, and I hope that you've been doing your math. How many do we have now? 5, very good. Okay, excellent. Some mathematicians in the audience. So we would have to go from 40 yearly to 5 yearly by 2050, because we think 5 gigatons is what we would naturally be able to absorb through our natural systems, and that would mean that we would be at net zero by 2050. That is the goal that is established in the Paris Agreement. That is the only safe trajectory that we can be on, but humanity has never done that. What we have done is exactly the opposite. Over the past few decades, what we did was go from 5 to 10 to 20 to 40. It's exactly the opposite. So now we have to retrace our steps with many more people on this planet, many more people to be fed, many more people to be given their natural birthright, their all the conditions that they deserve, and we have to go to 5. Well, that's a daunting task. So now you would say, is that possible? Is that at all possible to do that? Well, yes, it is possible. And the reason why that is possible is because in the 21st century, luckily, which is the century in which we start on this incredible challenge, 50 years into a new geological era, we actually have moved from a world that used to develop on a linear way. We've actually moved from linear to exponential. Those of you who work in technology or in communication are very, very familiar with exponential growth and exponential progress. But the rest of us humans are not. And the rest of us humans have been educated in a very linear way. And so just to think about the difference that is, if I take, so I'm a rather small person, as we've already established, so if I take 30 steps, I will probably be at the end of this platform with 30 linear steps, right? We could count it, but let's just take my word for it. If I take 30 exponential steps, I will have gone around the planet 26 times. That's the difference between thinking, planning, and executing in a linear way or in an exponential way. You will understand that this exercise is not one that we can do if we think, plan, and execute in a linear fashion. It can only be done if we do so exponentially. And fortunately, we actually have most of the tools. Some we've reserved for the younger generations to still develop, so don't think that there's nothing for you to do. But we have already moved into a world that is moving in exponential ways into the solution space of climate change. Now, the trick is that exponential curve of solutions is actually already competing with another exponential curve, which is the negative impacts of climate change. So think about two exponential curves, and I think you know what they look like, two curves, and if not, I'm going to draw them for you. That's what two exponential curves look like, right? Are you all with me? Okay. If it were linear, it would be. So the two exponential curves that are actually competing with each other, one is the exponential curve of the damages of climate change, and I guarantee that we're on an exponential curve. We will see more and more damages, which is why I warned the youngsters in the audience that you will be the first ones to experience the full impacts of climate change, because we're on that exponential curve of the impacts. But we're also on an exponential curve of the solutions. And so the question here is, which of those two is going to win? If the exponential curve of solutions is the one that we put our intentionality and our wisdom and our brains to, then we actually stand a very good chance. But if we don't, I guarantee that it is the exponential curve of damages that is going to win. So the conclusion from all of this is that we are incredibly privileged human beings. We're incredibly privileged because some of us, sorry to the youngsters here, some of us have actually lived in two ages, Anthropocene and the Holocene. But we are all together incredibly privileged because for the first time in the history of humankind, and we've only been modern human beings for about 6,000 years, so for the first time in the history of humankind, we actually stand the chance and we have the responsibility to collectively determine what the future of humanity is going to be, and also what the future of the biosphere is going to be. We have never had that ability. We've never had the technologies, we've never had the capital, we've never had the policies in hand as we do now. We are collectively deciding the future of humanity, meaning the quality of life, not only of people who are 20 and 30s now, but we're actually collectively deciding the quality of life of at least 7 generations down the line. That is an amazing responsibility that is on all of our shoulders. And I don't see anyone going, oh my God, that's too much for me. The point is, we're all sharing that responsibility. And by our choices and by our actions and by our decisions today, we are actually taking that decision, whether we know we're doing it or not. So, what is the good news in all of this? The good news in all of this is, as I mentioned before, that we're on this exponential curve of solutions in climate change that include many improvements that we will have for humanity. For example, I mentioned last night that we will be able to electrify 1.3 billion people around the world who today have no electricity, because the fossil fuel industry has no capacity to bring them the electricity that they need. These are 1.3 billion people that are in abject poverty. Most of them don't have enough food. They definitely don't have any healthy water. Those women walk for hours to go get firewood to cook for their children. It's a very those 1.3 billion people that are in extreme poverty are basically, in my mind, the sacrificed people of the Industrial Revolution. They're the ones that we left behind. And in this new revolution that we have already started, the energy revolution, based on renewables, those are the ones that we have to take care of first. We have to ensure that we do put solar panels on all of those little homes, wherever they are, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and that they do get their electricity, which is the basis of very, very first steps of family economic development. We can also, because we're addressing climate change, we will also be able to avoid the 7 million deaths that we are having every year because of air pollution. And air pollution is mainly caused by the burning of fossil fuels, which are also responsible for climate change. So as soon as we dispel fossil fuels from our electric grid, we will be able to avoid 7 million deaths of air pollution that are honestly unacceptable. How is it possible that we're killing 7 million people around the world because of the fuels that we are using to transport ourselves and to produce electricity? We will also be able to reduce the starvation due to food and water insecurity, because we will be planting trees. I hope 0.9 billion hectares, which is what we have. But even if we don't get to that much, we will definitely have to plant trees. We will definitely have to restore degraded lands, and we will have to stop deforestation. And if we do all of that, we will address climate change, but also for human capacity, we will be able to reduce starvation and water insecurity. We will also, very importantly, allow most people to stay home. We have 60 million people today who are already migrants. 40 million of them are migrants within their national territory, and 20 million of them, and growing, are migrants outside of their territory. And this is a story that you are very, very familiar with. If we do not address climate change, those 60 million will very quickly grow to 600 million. And so just imagine the international migratory catastrophe that we would have if we allow that to happen. Conversely, if we are able to restore the fertility of land and make home actually a safe place, most people would prefer to stay home, because that's where their ancestors are. That's where they have grown up, and they would rather do that. And so we definitely would want to reduce migration, not just because of the political unrest, but rather to give those people their quality of life. And that, of course, all of those, you can think of all of those advantages to addressing climate change translate into increased human well-being and certainly increased peace around the world, which I'm sure is something that we all would want. So let me finish by putting this rather revolutionary idea in front of you. From my perspective, addressing climate change, yes, it is about stopping the environmental damage. But I would hope that we humans, by the year 2019, are not only here on this planet just to reduce statistical negative impacts. I would hope that by this time, we humans have actually developed a much higher potential and a much higher purpose, and that we understand that yes, it is our responsibility to minimize the effects of climate change as much as possible for the generations that come. But I would hope that we also understand that addressing climate change is actually a global gym. What I mean by a global gym, when you go to your local gym, you go and you exercise your muscles, right? What I mean by a global gym, I mean that the challenge of addressing climate change is the gym, is the exercise area in which we humans exercise the leadership, the ingenuity, the innovation, and the responsibility that we're going to need to solve global problems in the 21st century. Because here is a promise. Climate change is the most urgent thing to address right now, but it's not the only global issue in the 21st century. We will have to address water, we will have to address food, we will have to address migration, we will have to address many other global issues. And climate change, because it's the most urgent, because it has a ticking clock, because we have to address it right now, it is actually the fantastic opportunity, it is the global gym for humanity to go to that global gym, address climate change, but through addressing climate change, understand and develop the strengths and the muscles that we're going to need for the rest of this century. And those muscles happen to be 3 or maybe 4. First, what I would call piercing alignment. The muscle of piercing alignment is one that will tell you that we can no longer afford to have one set of values for my family and another set of values for my work. Really? So your children are more important than somebody else's children? I'm sorry, we don't have space for that anymore. Piercing alignment, the values that you practice at home are the same values that you have to take to work and the same values you have to take to the world. And now it is time to do that. The second is radical collaboration. No more space for those in this sector, for architects to go over there and sociologists over here and farmers over there and scientists over in the other corner. I'm sorry, we can't afford that anymore. We have to be able to work intersectorally in order to be able to address the issues that are at hand. Thirdly, definitely passionate engagement. We do not have the space anymore for free riders on this world who are just here to, okay, fine, I was born into this and to this world and, I'm going to see what I do. No, we have to be passionately engaged. Wherever your passion takes you, wherever it takes you. To me, it happens to take me into climate change. But if your passion takes you into, any of the other natural sciences, if your passion takes you into architecture, if it takes you into health, if it takes you into nursing, wherever it takes you, but passionate engagement. Because just sitting back and letting the world happen is not going to be good news for your descendants. And finally, I wanted to make an invitation. And that is, I ascribe to an attitude toward the world that I call stubborn optimism. And the reason why I call it stubborn optimism is because I think that optimism is not the result of having achieved something. That is celebration. And I hope that you do celebrate. We don't celebrate enough all of our successes. So definitely celebrate your successes. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about optimism that is not the result of a success, but is rather the input with which we go into any challenge. It is the attitude with which we stand up in the world. It is the attitude of conviction that, yes, maybe individually I don't have it, but collectively we actually will be able to transform this world and to make the changes that are necessary. That is what I call optimism. And I call it stubborn optimism because there's no doubt that there are many, many challenges in front. No doubt that we will, slip on quite a few banana skins. There's going to be many different barriers, many different problems. Someone will throw a wrench in our way. So that's all predictable. Not to, should not paralyze us. We have to be perseverant about this. There is no other possibility that we have other than addressing climate change. Not solving it because we cannot, but addressing it so that we don't go over the very, very dangerous tipping points that we can discuss afterward. So, my friends, with all of that, can I invite all of you to become active members of the growing family of stubborn optimists and decide that you, from your perspective, whichever way you want, you're going to help to address climate change, and there are many ways that you can do that as individuals and as professionals, and we can discuss that later as well. Shalom. Thank you. Shalom.
Thanks, Christiana, for those inspiring words. One question, two questions? Okay, at the back, you had your hand up first, and then we'll break it in another few minutes.
Yeah, I would like to know what you think about the Extinction Rebellion movement.
I can actually make that extensive to the Extinction Rebellion and to the student strikers on Fridays for Future. I think they're awesome. I think they're totally awesome. Is there Fridays for Future movement here in Israel?
Yes.
Yeah, all right, awesome. So do go and support them. And Extinction Rebellion also. I mean, I think you understand that civil disobedience, and that is what these people are doing, it's civil disobedience. First of all, it's a very, very disciplined way of protesting, and I really appreciate their discipline. But civil disobedience has played a very, very critical role in the history of humanity. Think about South Africa. Think about Indian independence. Think about civil rights in the United States, right? So there are many, many different historical examples of civil disobedience where that has actually led to change. So yes, support Extinction Rebellion. I've been there many times on the streets with them. Yes, support the kids striking. They're doing a great job.
Great. We have to cut it.
It's two different things, but caused by the same. So what do I say about it? What I say about it is
the current situation in Israel. Now we got to the taxes on the green vehicles, like on these days.
okay. So I don't know the tax situation here, but it is completely unacceptable that any city would continue to have air pollution. I mean, honestly, we have the technologies to get rid of that, and we don't have to kill 7 million people a year. Really? In the year 2019, no more. Get rid of them.
Thanks very much, Diana.